He thought forcing an old woman to play the piano on live television would become the funniest moment of the season, but before the final note faded, every smile in the studio would disappear, and his own reputation would begin to crumble. Jason Carter had built his career on confidence, quick wit, and the ability to keep millions of viewers entertained every Friday night. His variety show ranked among the highest-rated programs in America because audiences never knew what surprise awaited them next. Sometimes celebrities competed in outrageous games. Sometimes ordinary guests found themselves in harmless but embarrassing situations that kept social media buzzing for days. Tonight, Jason believed he had found another unforgettable moment. Standing just beyond the bright stage lights was 68-year-old Evelyn Brooks. She wore a neatly pressed cream cardigan over a pale blue blouse, sensible dark slacks, and comfortable walking shoes that had clearly been polished with care. Her silver hair rested gently against her shoulders, and she carried an old canvas handbag with both hands as though it contained something precious. She looked exactly like the kind grandmother people politely smiled at in grocery stores before rushing past without another thought. Producers whispered into headsets while makeup artists hurried across the stage making last-minute adjustments. Camera operators rehearsed their sweeping shots as the studio audience settled into their seats, laughing and chatting beneath rows of dazzling lights. Jason glanced toward Evelyn from across the stage and smirked. She had entered a community talent giveaway after her granddaughter secretly submitted her name, mentioning only that her grandmother loved music. The producers had found the application charming but ordinary. Jason saw something different. He saw an easy joke. Leaning toward one of the producers, he lowered his voice just enough to avoid the nearest microphone. "Let's make this interesting," he said with a grin. "Bring out the concert grand. Tell her we're giving everyone 30 seconds to impress America." The producer hesitated for a heartbeat before nodding. Ratings mattered more than hesitation. Across the room, Evelyn quietly watched stagehands roll a magnificent black concert piano beneath the spotlight. Its polished surface reflected the glowing ceiling lights like still water beneath a summer sunset. She studied the instrument with calm eyes, saying nothing. One young production assistant noticed her expression. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It looked almost like recognition. Before he could think more about it, another crew member called him away. The countdown clock appeared on giant monitors. Audience members clapped in rhythm as music thundered through the speakers. Jason strode confidently to center stage, flashing his signature smile into camera one. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "our next guest says she enjoys playing a little piano. Let's see if tonight she can surprise us." Laughter rippled across the audience. Jason turned toward Evelyn with exaggerated politeness and extended one dramatic arm toward the waiting piano. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice dripping with playful confidence, "America is waiting." Evelyn lifted her eyes toward the glowing stage, took one slow breath, and began walking forward. The applause continued, but somewhere beneath the cheers, something invisible had already begun to change. Evelyn stepped onto the stage with measured grace, her footsteps almost disappearing beneath the applause that still carried traces of amusement rather than encouragement. Giant television cameras circled slowly around her, searching for every uncertain expression, every nervous glance that might entertain viewers watching from living rooms across the country. Jason folded his cue cards with a satisfied smile. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had imagined. The audience expected an awkward performance from an elderly woman who had wandered far outside her comfort zone. A few people in the front rows exchanged sympathetic looks, while others leaned forward with quiet anticipation, waiting for the inevitable mistake that would become tomorrow's viral clip. Evelyn stopped beside the gleaming concert piano without touching it. Instead, she studied the instrument with the patience of someone greeting an old friend after many years apart. The overhead lights reflected across the polished black surface, illuminating the faint lines on her face and the calm steadiness in her blue eyes. She did not seem distracted by the hundreds of spectators surrounding her. She simply listened. Somewhere beyond the walls of the studio, a distant train horn echoed through the city, reminding her of evenings long ago when music had filled every corner of her life. One of the younger camera operators quietly lowered his headset for a moment. There was something unusual about the silence surrounding her. Most nervous contestants shifted their weight, laughed awkwardly, or searched for reassurance. Evelyn did none of those things. She stood perfectly still, breathing slowly, as though the bright studio lights had disappeared completely. Jason noticed the pause and decided to keep the momentum alive. "Take your time," he joked, earning another wave of laughter from the audience. "The piano is not going anywhere." The crowd chuckled politely. Evelyn turned toward him and offered a gentle smile that held neither embarrassment nor resentment. "Thank you," she answered softly. Her voice was warm, steady, and unexpectedly confident. There was no trace of the hesitation everyone expected. Jason blinked for an instant before recovering his cheerful expression. He motioned dramatically toward the piano bench. "Whenever you are ready." Evelyn nodded once. As she lowered herself onto the bench, her fingertips rested lightly against the polished wood instead of the keys. Her eyes closed for only a heartbeat. Memories drifted across her mind without words. Endless practice rooms filled with afternoon sunlight. Quiet recital halls before audiences took their seats. The comforting scent of polished maple floors and fresh sheet music. She released a slow breath and opened her eyes again. The room remained filled with whispers. Several audience members reached for their phones, preparing to record what they assumed would be an amusing moment. A producer behind the control booth whispered that the cameras should stay close on her hands because viewers loved nervous reactions. Nobody questioned the decision. Nobody recognized the quiet dignity sitting beneath the spotlight. And as Evelyn finally lifted both hands above the waiting keyboard with effortless composure, an unfamiliar hush settled over the studio, as though the room itself sensed that the story everyone believed they were about to watch was no longer the story that was actually about to unfold. Evelyn allowed her hands to hover above the keyboard for one quiet moment longer, not because she was uncertain, but because she respected the silence before music was born. Jason glanced toward the control booth with growing impatience. The producer signaled for him to keep the energy alive. He stepped closer with the confident grin that had carried him through hundreds of live broadcasts. "Do not worry," he joked into the microphone. "If things become too difficult, we can always applaud the effort." Laughter echoed through the studio again, louder this time. Several members of the audience smiled politely while others laughed without hesitation. A judge seated near the front leaned toward another and whispered that perhaps someone should have suggested an easier activity. Even members of the house band exchanged amused looks. The grand piano standing beneath the bright lights was known for demanding exceptional control, and they assumed the elderly guest would struggle before she reached the second measure. Evelyn heard every word, every chuckle, every whisper that floated across the stage, yet her expression never changed. Her shoulders remained relaxed. Her breathing stayed slow and steady. Instead of looking toward the crowd, she looked down at the ivory keys with quiet affection. They were worn just enough to reveal years of performances by countless musicians before her. Her fingertips brushed the edges of several notes so lightly that no sound emerged. It looked less like hesitation and more like someone remembering the voice of an old companion. Backstage, one of the oldest lighting technicians paused his work. He had spent more than 30 years inside television studios and had watched nervous contestants freeze under pressure countless times. Something about Evelyn felt entirely different. There was no fear in the way she sat. There was only patience. Jason noticed the growing silence and decided to push a little further. "Mrs. Brooks," he said with exaggerated friendliness, "America is waiting for that first note." His words drew another ripple of laughter. Evelyn slowly lifted her head and met his eyes. "Music has never liked being rushed," she replied gently. The sentence was simple, almost whispered, but it carried an unexpected confidence that briefly caught Jason off guard. Before he could respond with another joke, she turned back toward the piano. Every camera zoomed closer. The giant screen suspended above the audience displayed a close view of her weathered hands resting gracefully over the keyboard. The room became strangely still. Even the audience members who had been preparing to laugh found themselves waiting instead. Then her fingers descended with effortless precision. A single note rang through the studio, clear as crystal, followed by another and then another, each one perfectly shaped, perfectly controlled. The melody unfolded with remarkable grace, filling every corner of the theater with warmth instead of uncertainty. The house band members instinctively looked toward one another. One violinist quietly lowered his instrument. A veteran sound engineer reached for his headphones, convinced he had accidentally switched to a pre-recorded track. Jason's smile faded almost imperceptibly. He had expected awkward pauses, missed notes, and uncomfortable laughter. Instead, the entire studio seemed to be holding its breath as the opening phrases floated through the air with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime speaking the language of music. The melody continued to unfold with remarkable elegance, each phrase flowing naturally into the next as though the piano itself had been waiting years for Evelyn to return. The opening passage had already erased every expectation of failure, but what came next transformed quiet surprise into complete disbelief. Her fingers moved with effortless confidence across the keyboard, never rushing, never hesitating, shaping every note with extraordinary precision. It was not simply technical skill. It was storytelling without words. Every chord carried warmth. Every pause carried meaning. Every transition felt deliberate, inviting the audience into memories they could somehow feel without understanding why. The studio that had echoed with laughter only moments earlier now rested beneath an almost sacred silence. Camera operators forgot to follow their planned movements, lingering instead on Evelyn's calm expression. The production assistant responsible for signaling audience reactions lowered his cue card without realizing it. There was no need to instruct applause or laughter anymore. Everyone had become completely absorbed. Jason stood only a few feet away, still holding his microphone, but he no longer searched for another clever remark. His practiced smile slowly disappeared as confusion gave way to disbelief. This was not supposed to happen. The harmless joke that had seemed guaranteed to entertain millions of viewers was quietly slipping beyond his control. Behind the judges' table, the music director narrowed his eyes and leaned closer to the stage. He recognized subtle interpretations that only exceptionally trained concert pianists typically attempted. Evelyn was not simply reproducing notes from memory. She was reshaping the music with remarkable maturity, allowing every phrase to breathe naturally before carrying it forward again. One of the judges instinctively reached for the printed program, searching for details about the quiet woman seated at the piano. There was almost nothing written about her beyond her name, age, and hometown. Another judge whispered, "Who taught her?" No one answered. Even members of the house band had stopped pretending to organize their instruments. The first violinist slowly smiled in admiration while the principal cellist shook his head almost imperceptibly, recognizing decades of discipline hidden beneath Evelyn's simple appearance. Across the studio, a teenage audience member who had laughed moments earlier lowered his phone and simply listened. Beside him, his mother quietly wiped away unexpected tears. Neither could explain why the performance felt so deeply personal. It was as though every note carried the quiet strength of a lifetime spent choosing dignity over recognition. Evelyn remained completely unaware of the growing astonishment surrounding her. Her attention never drifted toward the cameras, the judges, or the audience. She played only for the music itself. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her breathing remained perfectly steady. Occasionally a faint smile appeared as familiar passages returned like cherished memories shared with an old friend. The final movement approached with increasing complexity, demanding extraordinary speed, control, and emotional balance. Several musicians exchanged uncertain glances, wondering whether anyone of her age could possibly navigate what was coming next. Jason found himself holding his breath along with everyone else. For the first time in years, the host who always knew exactly what to say realized he had no words at all, because the woman he believed would become the evening's joke was quietly transforming the entire theater into a room filled with wonder. The music climbed into its most demanding passages with a confidence that seemed almost impossible to explain. Notes raced across the keyboard in graceful cascades, yet every phrase remained perfectly balanced, every dynamic carefully measured, every pause filled with quiet intention rather than uncertainty. The concert grand responded as though it recognized the hands guiding it, releasing a rich, resonant voice that wrapped itself around every seat in the theater. No one shifted in their chairs anymore. No one reached for a phone. Even the bright red recording lights on the cameras seemed less noticeable than the melody flowing through the room. Jason slowly lowered his microphone to his side. For the first time since becoming the face of the network's most successful variety show, he realized that interrupting would feel almost disrespectful. His producer spoke urgently through his earpiece, asking him to prepare a transition, but he ignored them without even realizing it. Every instinct told him to let the performance continue. Inside the control room, the executive producer stared silently at the live audience monitor. The social media team had already begun reporting an unusual surge in viewer engagement. Thousands of comments were appearing every minute. At first, people had expected a humorous segment. Now viewers were asking the same question again and again. Who is Evelyn Brooks? No one inside the studio seemed to know the answer. Near the judges' table, an elderly guest conductor who had been invited for a later segment slowly rose from his chair. His expression carried something deeper than surprise. It was recognition mixed with disbelief. He studied Evelyn's posture, the relaxed curve of her wrists, the elegant phrasing, and the unmistakable discipline hidden inside every movement. He whispered a name under his breath, but the words were lost beneath the music. Beside him, another guest noticed his reaction. "Do you know her?" she asked quietly. He did not answer immediately. His eyes never left the stage. Instead, he watched as Evelyn entered the final pages of the composition with complete command, navigating technical passages that challenged even internationally celebrated performers. Every difficult sequence sounded effortless. There was no struggle. There was only beauty shaped by decades of patience, sacrifice, and devotion. Jason felt an uncomfortable weight settle inside him. Only minutes earlier he had looked at Evelyn and seen nothing more than an opportunity for laughter. Now he found himself wondering how many remarkable people had quietly walked through his life while he had been too distracted by appearances to notice. Across the audience, expressions had completely transformed. Some people smiled through tears. Others simply sat motionless, afraid that even breathing too loudly might disturb the moment. The applause they wanted to offer had become trapped behind overwhelming admiration. Evelyn remained entirely focused on the keyboard, unaware that the room around her had changed forever. Then, with extraordinary control, she reached the final soaring passage. Her fingers floated effortlessly across the last brilliant sequence before settling into one final chord that rang through the theater with breathtaking clarity. The sound lingered beneath the studio lights long after her hands had become still, and in that unforgettable silence, every person in the room understood they had witnessed something far greater than a television performance. They had witnessed quiet greatness revealing itself without asking anyone's permission. For several endless seconds, nobody moved. The final chord continued to shimmer through the studio before dissolving into complete silence, a silence so profound that it seemed louder than the applause that had not yet begun. Evelyn gently lifted her hands from the keyboard and rested them in her lap. She lowered her eyes with quiet humility, as though she had simply finished an ordinary piece at home instead of delivering one of the most unforgettable performances the network had ever broadcast. Then, from the front row, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound echoed clearly through the theater. Every head turned toward the elderly guest conductor who had remained standing throughout the final movement. His eyes glistened as he continued applauding with unwavering respect. Within seconds another person joined him, then another, until the entire audience rose to its feet. The applause rolled across the studio like a powerful wave, growing louder with every passing moment. Several musicians in the house band stood as well, setting their instruments aside before applauding with genuine admiration. Jason remained frozen where he stood. His carefully rehearsed smile had vanished completely, replaced by an expression that revealed something unfamiliar to millions of viewers watching at home. Humility. The applause continued for nearly a full minute before the guest conductor slowly made his way toward the stage. Every camera instinctively followed him. He stopped beside the piano and looked at Evelyn with quiet disbelief before speaking into the silence that finally settled once again. "Please forgive me if I am mistaken," he said gently, "but are you Evelyn Brooks who performed with the New York Philharmonic more than 40 years ago?" A quiet gasp swept through the audience. Jason looked sharply toward Evelyn, his eyes widening. The producers exchanged confused glances inside the control room, rapidly searching through every document they had collected before the show. Evelyn hesitated for only a moment before offering a modest smile. "Yes," she answered softly. "That was a very long time ago." The conductor closed his eyes briefly, almost overwhelmed by the realization. "I was a young assistant musician then," he said. "I still remember critics calling your interpretation one of the most moving performances they had ever heard." The room fell silent once more. No one had expected those words. No one had imagined that the quiet grandmother who had walked onto the stage carrying a worn canvas handbag had once stood among the finest concert artists in the country. One of the judges whispered in disbelief, "Why did she disappear?" Evelyn folded her hands together and answered with the same calm grace she had shown from the beginning. "Life changed," she said simply. "My husband became ill. After he passed away, my daughter needed help raising her little girl. Music never left my heart, but my family needed my hands more than the stage did." Not a single person interrupted her. Jason lowered his head, remembering every careless joke he had made only minutes earlier. The audience no longer saw an elderly contestant who had wandered onto a television program. They saw a woman who had quietly exchanged worldwide recognition for love, responsibility, and family without asking for applause, and somehow that sacrifice made her extraordinary performance feel even more unforgettable. Jason Carter had faced difficult interviews, unpredictable celebrities, and live television mishaps throughout his career, yet nothing had prepared him for the weight of his own conscience. He looked across the stage at Evelyn Brooks and realized that every clever remark he had made only minutes earlier now echoed in his memory with painful clarity. The laughter he had encouraged no longer sounded entertaining. It sounded careless. The control room buzzed with frantic excitement as producers celebrated record-breaking viewer numbers, but no one dared interrupt the remarkable moment unfolding before them. The story had escaped every script they had prepared. It no longer belonged to television. It belonged to truth. Jason slowly walked toward the piano, his usual confident stride replaced by quiet hesitation. The audience watched every step. Millions of viewers watched with equal anticipation from their homes. Standing beside Evelyn, he lowered his microphone for a brief moment before speaking with a sincerity rarely seen on live television. "Mrs. Brooks," he said softly, "I owe you an apology." The room became completely silent once again. Jason continued without looking away. "When you arrived tonight, I saw your appearance before I saw the person standing in front of me. I assumed I knew your story without taking even 1 minute to learn it. That was my mistake." Evelyn looked at him with calm eyes, offering neither triumph nor resentment. She simply listened. Jason drew a slow breath. "I thought I was creating entertainment," he admitted. "Instead, you reminded all of us what genuine excellence looks like. Thank you for showing us that talent does not disappear simply because the world stops paying attention." Several audience members quietly wiped away tears. Even members of the production crew who normally rushed from one assignment to another stood motionless, allowing the cameras to continue recording without interruption. The elderly conductor smiled gently as he watched the exchange. "The greatest artists," he said, addressing both Jason and the audience, "never spend their lives proving they are extraordinary. They simply remain faithful to the gift they were given, whether anyone is watching or not." His words settled over the theater with remarkable simplicity. Evelyn finally spoke. "Life gives every person different seasons," she said. "Some seasons place us under bright lights. Others ask us to care for people we love behind closed doors. Neither season is more important than the other." No one interrupted. Every sentence carried the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived far beyond applause. Jason nodded slowly, understanding that her greatest achievement was not the concert halls she had once filled, but but the humility she had carried long after leaving them behind. The standing ovation resumed, louder than before, yet Evelyn accepted it exactly as she had accepted the silence before her performance, with grace, gratitude, and remarkable peace. At that moment, everyone in the studio understood that the most unforgettable part of the evening had never been the flawless music itself. It had been the quiet character of the woman who never needed recognition to become truly unforgettable. As the applause gradually softened, the studio lights seemed warmer than they had only a few minutes earlier. The atmosphere had completely transformed. The audience that had once expected amusement now looked toward Evelyn Brooks with unmistakable admiration. Producers quietly abandoned the remaining schedule for the evening, realizing that nothing they had planned could possibly equal the authenticity unfolding before them. Jason turned toward the executive producer, who stood just beyond the cameras, and received a simple nod. For the first time in years, the show would move forward without its carefully scripted outline. Jason looked back at Evelyn. "There is one question I think everyone watching wants to ask," he said respectfully. "After everything you accomplished, why did you never return to the stage?" Evelyn smiled gently before answering. "Because success is not measured only by the number of people who know your name," she said. "Sometimes success is helping your daughter sleep through another difficult night after losing her husband. Sometimes it is attending your granddaughter's school recital instead of your own concert. Sometimes success is simply being present where you are needed most." Her words settled over the audience with remarkable quiet. A young woman seated near the front clasped her father's hand. An older couple exchanged knowing smiles. Across the country, countless viewers found themselves thinking about people in their own lives whose sacrifices had gone unnoticed. The elderly conductor stepped forward once more. "The music world searched for you for years," he admitted. "There were rumors that you had retired, moved overseas, or simply stopped playing. None of us imagined that you had chosen family over fame." Evelyn nodded softly. "Music never disappeared," she replied. "It simply moved from concert halls into my living room. My granddaughter learned her first scales on an old upright piano. My neighbors heard evening melodies through open windows. The audience became smaller, but the joy remained exactly the same." The conductor smiled with deep respect. "Then the world lost a famous pianist, but one family gained an extraordinary mother and grandmother." The audience answered with another wave of heartfelt applause. Jason noticed a young production assistant standing near the edge of the stage holding Evelyn's worn canvas handbag. Earlier that evening, several crew members had barely noticed it. Now the assistant carried it with the same care someone might give a treasured instrument. Small moments like that revealed how completely the room had changed. Appearances no longer mattered. Character did. One of the judges quietly removed the contestant scorecards from the table and set them aside. "There is nothing to score," she said with a smile. "Some performances are competitions. Others are reminders." Jason looked toward the nearest camera before turning back to Evelyn. He no longer saw an overlooked elderly woman. He saw someone whose quiet choices had become more inspiring than any trophy or standing ovation. Under the bright studio lights, surrounded by people who had finally learned her story, Evelyn remained exactly the same person who had walked onto the stage carrying an old canvas handbag. The only thing that had truly changed was the way everyone else had learned to see her. When the applause finally settled into a gentle murmur, Jason looked across the studio with new eyes. The audience, the judges, the musicians, and every member of the production crew seemed united by the same quiet realization. They had all arrived expecting entertainment, but they were leaving with something far more valuable. Jason stepped toward center stage one final time and turned to Evelyn with genuine respect. "Mrs. Brooks," he said softly, "this stage was supposed to introduce America to another contestant. Instead, it reminded America of something we should never have forgotten." Evelyn smiled with the same calm grace that had remained unchanged from the moment she first entered the studio. She accepted neither praise nor attention as though either belonged to her alone. Instead, she gently reached for her old canvas handbag, thanked the conductor, shook hands with the judges, and quietly thanked every member of the house band for sharing the stage with her. Several musicians admitted that performing beside her had become one of the greatest honors of their careers. The youngest pianist in the orchestra asked if he could help carry her bag, but Evelyn simply laughed softly and said, "Thank you, but it has traveled with me for many years. I think we can finish this journey together." Her answer drew warm smiles throughout the theater. As she slowly walked toward the exit, every person standing near the aisle instinctively stepped aside, not because anyone asked them to, but because respect had replaced curiosity. The audience rose once more without instruction. No applause signs flashed across the studio. No producer signaled the crowd. They stood because it felt like the only appropriate response. Jason remained quietly watching until Evelyn disappeared beyond the bright lights and into the hallway where ordinary life was waiting for her once again. Later that evening, clips from the performance spread across the country. Headlines celebrated the remarkable music, but the comments beneath them revealed something even more meaningful. Thousands of people shared stories about parents, grandparents, teachers, neighbors, and friends whose quiet talents had been overlooked for years simply because they never sought attention. Music schools replayed the performance for their students. Community centers invited older musicians back to their stages. Families called relatives they had not spoken with in months. A single evening of unexpected humility had quietly inspired countless acts of appreciation far beyond the television studio. Jason ended the broadcast differently than he had rehearsed. Looking directly into the camera, he spoke without jokes, without clever lines, and without performance. "Tonight we learned that appearances introduce a person, but character tells their story. We almost laughed at greatness simply because it arrived wearing ordinary clothes. May we never make that mistake again." Somewhere outside, the city continued its busy rhythm as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside the hearts of everyone who had witnessed Evelyn Brooks that evening, something had changed forever. They would remember that true excellence does not demand recognition, genuine dignity never needs to announce itself, and the brightest light in any room often belongs to the quietest person standing inside it. And on that unforgettable night, the world did not simply remember an extraordinary pianist. It remembered what respect truly sounds like.